compassion, but it's not the full picture. Empathy alone is not enough. So that's why she says empathy, feeling of empathy, and the wish to help. This is compassion, the wish for oneself and others to be free of suffering, free from all painful, unwanted, unsatisfactory experiences. It acknowledges that everyone wants to be free of suffering, deserves to be free, and has the capacity to be free. So it's based on a lot of the same thoughts that we saw earlier, the sameness of others, that we're all the same in our fundamental situation. So let's talk a little bit about empathy, because I think it does touch on this idea that Laura brought up too, that one of the, maybe I'll introduce these and then we'll go into empathy. When we talk about compassion, this desire to have the suffering of others or oneself alleviated, to have it relieved, there's a far enemy of this, and then there are two near enemies of this. Now, Thupten Jinpa in his book only points out one near enemy, but the second one is something that will lead me into this discussion about our empathy and making sure that it's more balanced. The first thing that was mentioned was the far enemy of compassion. The far enemy of compassion, anyone know what this is? What is your thought of somebody who is totally uncompassionate in the moment? What are they doing? They're being what? Self-centered to some degree, but how is that manifesting in terms of insincere, apathetic? I'm not hearing the word yet. Sorry, I'll just give you the word. Cruelty. So I mean, if you've ever seen, Chogyam Trungpa actually uses this as an example of how he was able to stir up compassion in his heart, was that he would think about the cruelty that young boys were showing to a puppy that they were stoning, and that kind of brings up this well of compassion, because he sees and this is what's interesting, is we often have the most compassionate responses in the face of the worst cruelty that we see. But cruelty is the exact opposite of compassion. It is where, going back to that idea of the soft spot, where somebody has completely armored that soft spot. Maybe there's still a crack in there, a place where you can maybe open it up and get in there. But there's this armoring over the soft spot that keeps one out of touch with one's heart. And one is capable of being cruel. I mean, I fortunately have never had that where I've been quite intentionally cruel to animals or what have you. There's a woman who came to the center for a while who talked about how her brothers were that way. They would like to harm and torture animals and things, and how this really broke her heart from a very young age. She just couldn't tolerate harm to animals, and has become that's one of the main things that she's quite active around, is trying to stop harm to animals. But we do know that this exists, that people have gotten to that level of armoring that soft spot to that degree. That's the far enemy of compassion, because it's showing when compassion is more or less lacking. Now, does that mean that that person who's cruel in the moment, who's torturing a person or an animal or whatever the case might be, that they have no compassion? Again, it doesn't mean that it's completely blocked out, but it is in the space of that mind that compassion can't be seen. There's a wonderful story that I like to share. I don't think I shared this the last time I was here. There's a teacher in the Against the Stream organization. Some of you have heard of this, that, God, what is his name? I'm having difficulty with names today. The son of Noah Levine, son of Stephen and Andrea Levine. I don't know if you've heard of him. Noah Levine spent some time in prison. He was raised by two incredible spiritual teachers, and he went the exact opposite direction. He needed to just kind of rebel against a lot of that. And he spent some time in prison, and it was then that he actually came to rely upon the teachings of the Buddha and meditation and so on to get him through his time in prison. And when he came out, he started this organization. And one of the people who teaches for him is this guy named Vinnie Ferraro. And Vinny grew up in Connecticut, and I was surprised to hear in his story that there are gangs in Connecticut. I mean, you wouldn't think, I don't know. I've never been to Connecticut, so I just have this impression of it being like kind of a Spartan sort of wonderful place where, everybody's kind and very, white fence posts, and, there are gangs there. And I think I can't remember the city that he was a gang in, but he was a part of a gang in, but they would go out with baseball bats at night to beat up homeless people. And the story goes that he was, in this one particular evening, came across this homeless man, and they were all sort of around him. And Vinny had his bat held high like he was going to beat this guy. And the guy connected eyes with him and said, "Please don't do this to me." And Vinny looked at him and said, "What makes you think I'm not going to do this to you?" And the man said back to him, "Because you have the most compassionate eyes I've ever seen." And Vinny dropped the bat. He couldn't do it, and he could never do it again, because that armored heart was broken open. I mean, something happened by this connection. I mean, who knows? This might have been a Buddha appearing, before Vinny, to kind of help him on his path. But from there, he turned the corner completely. He went into a spiritual path. He's now a teacher for their tradition. And it's quite amazing when you hear those stories. And I mean, I have no reason to suspect this story. I can't vouch for its validity. I wasn't there with Vinny, holding a baseball bat too. But I can certainly, understand that this is possible. And it means that, again, even those people who've gone to that extreme of cruelty have the potential to be compassionate. And they might not, they might need something like that that's a huge catalyst for them to move in another direction. Or they might, over time, just be exposed to things that help them to think more compassionately. There's many stories out there. I was reading one in Lion's Roar magazine about a man who was involved with white supremacists for a number of years and doing a lot of pretty horrible things. And his path of opening started with a young woman at a cash register he was being really rude and stuff. And she said to him, "I think you're more than what you are showing yourself to be." And that was kind of the beginning of the doorway, and it opened over time. It wasn't this huge, St. Paul kind of moment or something. It was rather a gradual opening. But I'm just pointing that out because even when we see, this is a helpful way to even look at people once more that we're trying to generate compassion for, that if we see them embodying this complete opposite, this far enemy of compassion, we see them being incredibly cruel, know that they still have that potential. They have the ability to awaken completely through compassion and loving kindness and become a Buddha. It's not that there's something permanent about that armoring around their heart. So that's the far enemy. The near enemies of compassion are twofold. And again, Thupten Jinpa just points out the one, which is pity. Pity kind of feels like compassion, but when, sometimes we even use this word in some of our prayers. It says pitiful sentient beings. Don't think that means that we should be generating pity for them, because pity is actually a feeling of superiority. It's a bit of I'm up here not suffering, you're down there suffering. Oh, poor you. Let me do what I can to throw something at you to relieve your suffering. There's that flavor to it. Not always. I mean, just in general, this is the nature of pity. So don't think that what we're aiming for is that feeling of kind of superiority, and that everyone else, poor them, they're all suffering, and we can somehow benefit from that vantage point of transcending that or something. Rather, we want to be identifying with their suffering. We want to be able to be there at the same level, understanding the sameness of the suffering that others are experiencing. But the other near enemy is really quite interesting. In the translation that is sometimes given, it's called overwhelm. And this is a bit of what Laura was talking about, I think. If I'm not, I might be putting words in your mouth. When we kind of feel like we've gone too far emotionally, and we are almost feeling what the other person's going through to too much of a degree, to where it starts to have an effect upon us, as if it's our pain. Empathy is an important kind of dimension, that we have to be able to feel the pain of others. We have to be able to recognize what they're going through. But there's still the other side of empathy, which is that is still their individual experience. And if we want to be genuinely helpful at the time, we can't fall into this kind of despair or overwhelm. I think the literal translation for the term, this is according to Pema Chodron, is horrified anxiety. Horrified anxiety. I mean, that's what overwhelm feels like, right? It's an anxiety at seeing the suffering that's going on, and it's horrified, but it's paralyzed. There's not an ability to act from that place, because our emotions have gotten totally caught up in it. They're totally absorbed in what's going on, and we don't have the vantage point of the other side of empathy, which is not just this, what they call affective empathy. It's spelled AFFECTIVE, affective empathy, but rather we have to have cognitive empathy. We have to have an ability to understand that what the person is going through is still their own situation and requires us to be able to be attentive to what needs to happen, to alleviate their suffering, to actually respond to it creatively. Otherwise, we just fall into the affective empathy and we just drown in it. Our emotions are totally with the other person. It's as if we're going through it. Well, you aren't going through it. You're trying to identify what the person's going through and be with them in their suffering. But you have to have that more kind of, again, these are a bit of like the heart and the head again. Our heart needs to be invested, but our head needs to be in control in terms of knowing how to respond effectively to what's going on. And this is where burnout comes from, what Anna's saying. Burnout comes from people being too much on the affective side, where you get totally absorbed into it and you don't have the delineation any longer of yourself and the other person. And in that way, you can't, as an outside agent, help them in more constructive ways. Yeah, Renee, the microphone for Renee.
So from the Buddhist perspective, is there a technique to deal with that type of overwhelm?
Well, I would say that part of what we have to do is to, again, recognize that there still is an individual experience of suffering that's going on in front of us, that we are different from that. We don't want to make ourselves totally different from that to where we no longer have the affective part of it and are only trying to cognitively solve the problem. But rather we have to have a more balanced approach. This is why, again, this is called the balanced empathy, that we can hold both views at the same time. I would say that, again, most of it requires us to simply, try to correct it as much as possible by moving in the other direction, moving in the direction of saying, and what can I do about this? It doesn't have to be this way for this person. They don't have to be suffering. Now, again, some suffering we have to accept is going on in the world, and we can't do much in the moment to alleviate it. But we can do something from our own side to work on our own qualities, rather than sitting there at our, crying all day because we're just overwhelmed at all the suffering there is in the world. So regardless of what the situation is, if we go totally to the emotional side of it, it's not going to be useful. We have to be able to withdraw from that and say, this still is something that is objectively happening out there. I need to work on myself to become better qualified to address the suffering of the world, which of course the Buddhist path is entirely about. How do we actually help others in that state of suffering? So there are some thoughts that can be useful, to certainly practice some level of equanimity, I think, to make sure that we do understand that, there's an ability to kind of identify with what's going on and to see others in their situation and to want them to be free from all of that. But we still have to pull ourselves away from that to some degree. I think that each of us will have to find our own path to some degree in navigating these two, because the affective part, some of us are stronger on that side already. Our hearts are kind of a bit raw and open, and we naturally gravitate towards that, and we want to be with others in the space of their suffering. But then when it comes to, what needs to actually be done to address it, we might be weaker on that side, and we don't have quite that cognitive component. So if we recognize that we can make ourselves more qualified to deal with others' pain and suffering, then we try to correct it by moving in that direction, trying to reassert, yes, and I need to be better capable to handle the suffering of others and to address it. As I said, we can't address it in the moment, perhaps. If I see people who are suffering in some part of the world, it doesn't mean that I can necessarily get on a plane, go there, and be of some use and benefit when I don't even know the skills and abilities that might be needed there. But I can respond to that suffering in more creative ways by working on myself, so I can become more capable in the state of enlightenment to relieve the suffering of all beings. You see what I mean? Other people will be much more inclined cognitively because they've got a bit more armoring around the soft spot perhaps, and they're only going to think about solving the problem and getting kind of things taken care of, but their heart's not going to be in it. They're not going to be that real affectionate. It's kind of like people who have, doctors who have bad bedside manner, right? They're really about fixing everything and kind of treating you as the patient that has something going wrong and they're going to take care of it. But their heart's not there with you saying, oh, I'm so sorry that you're going through this. And, they're not identifying at that level. Well, then we have to correct the other way and put in more of the affective component. Really kind of put ourselves in their shoes. That's what that whole affective side is all about, kind of identifying the suffering of another as if it were your own, but then recognizing that it is not your own, and you have to do something as an agent to help alleviate as best as you can. Would that help a little bit? I don't know.
Did you write this article that I read last night? For everything in it.
Really? Maybe you should read it. It might be better than what I just said. What is the article, Kristen?
Oh, actually, it's Trump's America Needs and Buddhist Ethics of Care. But like a lot of the things, God, I just scrolled now away from it. That you paraphrased almost. Sorry, from this article that I was looking at last night and wondering about, you paraphrase so much. Like this fellow that wrote the book Against Empathy mentions that meditation is an important tool that diminishes empathy so one can be compassionate without suffering themselves, which you just went through. And also it says that that the Dalai Lama makes the distinction between empathy and compassion, just like the Catherine McDonald quote you read. He says, compassion in contrast is not just sharing experience with others, but wishing to see them relieved of their suffering. One can feel empathy for a neighbor whose house burned down in a fire without doing anything to help. Compassion requires taking the next step and offering them shelter. So,
very good.
Everything that was kind of confusing me from about this yesterday, you covered. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing that,
I think you worded it better too.
You're too kind. No, so going back to this idea of this balanced empathy, when we have a balanced empathy, then our compassion is going to be very effective, because we're going to be able to respond not just from the place of being with somebody in their suffering and feeling what they're feeling and kind of being able to identify at that level, but from the vantage point that we are in a position to help them in their suffering. We're in a position to help alleviate their suffering. As I said, it doesn't mean that in every situation you have the exact skills and ability to do that, because we know we don't. You know, it'd be ridiculous again for me to, if there's a huge medical crisis somewhere in Africa, for me to get on a plane and go there when I know nothing about medicine. What am I going to do? But if I can, get out my checkbook or my credit card and go online and give money to Doctors Without Borders and know that they're going to go over there and do the work for me, then that's a compassionate response to that. It's not just me going, oh, those poor people, they're all suffering and I feel so bad about them, and you just start, sitting in your tears. One friend of mine who's Buddhist, she knew somebody who actually went to the Dalai Lama frequently for advice on her own personal practice. And she asked the Dalai Lama once, she said, I've been doing these meditations on compassion, and I find that when I start getting into that place of compassion, I just start crying, just in tears. Is this a good sign? And His Holiness said, well, it's a good sign, but it doesn't mean you're there yet. Now, I don't know, I'm relating that story. This was advice given to an individual. I have no idea her whole background and her spiritual practice. But how I took it when I heard that was that just having that emotive component, that affective empathy, isn't enough. If we're just kind of sitting there and just bawling our eyes out because of the suffering of the world, does that do any good in the end? I mean, it helps us to identify with suffering initially, but it's only a stepping stone to get you into that more cognitive side of it, where you say, and how do I relieve the suffering of others? And that's a bit of what we're talking about with immeasurable compassion in the Mahayana context, is that we do need that component of identifying with the suffering of others. Even though it is their suffering, we need to have that willingness to feel that, to open our hearts to that. And we need to also be able to pull back and say, and I'm in a position that is different than that, and therefore I can do what I can to help alleviate that suffering. Even if it means just writing the check or sitting on your cushion and really strengthening your own bodhicitta. Whatever it looks like, that is your cognitive response to the suffering of the world. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. Yes. Yeah, Susan.
Yeah, I used
Is that on?
There we go. So I used to be a therapist, and I got compassion overload. And I continued to work as a layperson with addiction. And what you had said earlier, I had stepped out about, I can't tie somebody's shoes for the next 40 years.
Right.
And recognizing that, part of my practice is coming to realize that I'm limited in what I can, I mean, we're talking about infinite,
Right.
but in what I can actually, how I can actually assist another person
Right.
is limited.
Mm-hmm.
I can share my experience, strength, and hope with what I've learned through the practice of Buddhism, what I've learned through the practice of a 12-step program, but in the end, the work that needs to be done is the other person's. It's not mine.
Right.
And I'm smack dab in the middle of this right now, and it is just, up in my face, and I have infinite compassion for this person, and I also recognize there's nothing I can do against a closed mind.
Right. Right.
Except to continue to plant little seeds and let that person know that I'm not judging them as less than. I really have a deep desire for them to recover, but they have to do the work.
Right. Right. Yeah, I appreciate that perspective, because I think that is really an important thing to acknowledge, is that when it comes to the temporal situations, frequently there is nothing more that we can do. Nonetheless, within a Buddhist perspective and the Mahayana perspective, that's further impetus for us to do the deeper work on ourselves, because we see that we can then be better qualified to help others in other ways that we can't currently do. Like if you were a Buddha, fully enlightened, maybe you are a Buddha, I don't know. But if you were fully enlightened, then you could be of so much more benefit to that person, because you would know their whole karma and everything that led them to that moment of having the addiction that they have and everything, and you could say to them things that might snap them out of it. Whereas in our limited, perspective, how can we possibly address it at that level? There's a wonderful quote that I wanted to share from Lama Yeshe that kind of talks about this and how bodhicitta is the answer to this. He says, if you take a proper look deep into your heart, you will see that one of the main causes of your dissatisfaction is the fact that you are not helping others as best you can. When you realize this, you'll be able to say to yourself, I must develop myself so that I can help others satisfactorily. By improving myself, I can definitely help. Thus, you have more strength and energy to meditate, to keep pure morality, and do other good things. You have energy because I want to help others. So this is where we can take the frustration we feel at a situation like that, where we can't help others, we aren't able to, we're simply incapable of in our current situation, and say, I want to help them, therefore I need to work on myself. Yes, Diane.
And
Thanks for sharing that.
That kind of leads me to a question that I'd had before we even gathered this session.
Mm-hmm.
I find myself in situations where there's been a wreck on the other lane in the road, or I hear about a family that got burned out of their home, or the horrors that we deal with, that and then sometimes they're even personal, but we know we're limited. Is there a prayer that addresses, and it may be a loving kindness prayer that we make up at the time based on what we are aware of, or is there a kind of generalist prayer? Because I feel like praying for that person or that situation sends love out there in its small way. And
in a big way,
helps me feel like I have some kind of power.
Sure. Thank you for that, Diane. No, I'd say absolutely that these sorts of prayers that we're doing, if at the moment when you see a wreck or there's something on the news about people in a horrible situation, and if at that moment we generate thoughts of loving kindness and compassion, sincerely wanting them to be free from suffering, wanting them to have happiness, I think that's very powerful. Of course, the one practice that's emphasized in this tradition, we'll talk a little bit again tomorrow afternoon, is Tonglen, is this idea that we can actually do a very visceral meditation on removing the suffering of others and giving them happiness. We'll talk about that a little bit. I think most of you in the room have some exposure to Tonglen, but I'll talk about it as part of tomorrow afternoon. I keep saying tomorrow, and we'll get to all these things. We'll be here till maybe 6 or 7 tomorrow night. No, just kidding. But so I don't know. Let me check back with Laura. Did that kind of address a bit of what your question was in terms of to store? Yeah. Okay. Because I mean, we can get to a place where we feel a bit of that overwhelm and that kind of. Did you want to say a little bit more from your?
Well, of course, I think it's more of a challenge just as well as it's easier to have compassion for those closer to you. It's also easier to feel, the pain and suffering of those close to you.
Absolutely.
And so it's just a matter of, that wisdom.
Right.
Of trying not to have an overwhelm.
Right.
And, even in when you're in healthcare, it's kind of the same thing. It's that overwhelm. It's that burnout. So, it did help.
Good. Okay. Because again, the whole premise for having empathy is the fact that we're not alone in our vulnerability. We all know our own vulnerability, that we are subject to suffering, that we are subject to things not going the way we want, to having to be separated from the things we love. All of this is part of existence, is this continual state of vulnerability or uncertainty that we have. But it's shared. Every single being is working from that same place. And so we begin to identify the common vulnerability, that common experience that we have with others. And again, be able to pull back and say yes, but that still is their unique experience. And if I'm going to be of any use and benefit in this situation, I need to not identify with it completely at that level. I need to be able to pull back and do what needs to be done or can be done, or at least work on improving myself so I will be more capable in the future. Yeah. Okay, thanks. Yes, Andre.
I'm sort of chomping at the bit here. I'm sorry. Because I think there's a misunderstanding. I've been racking my brain trying to figure. It's this textbook, or this book that we use as a textbook for the guys in prison, and I can't think of the author's name, and I can't think of the book itself. It'll come to me at some point. But one of the things we tend to forget, or we aren't aware of, when it comes to compassion, there is a no side to compassion. Compassion isn't always yes, yes, yes. Right. Sometimes the most compassionate thing we can do is say no. I can't do that for you, especially if we know that what this person is asking for, requiring, will be harmful. When our children are trying to do things that we know aren't good for them, the most compassionate thing to do is to say no, don't do that. And so when you deal with people and you're trying to teach compassion and stuff, especially in the prisons, and I don't think it's just prisons, but oftentimes they say, well, I can't do that because now I'm going to be considered a doormat, and people are going to walk all over me and so forth. Right. And that's not necessarily the case. Right. I tell them, when I didn't live a compassionate life, when this wasn't my practice, and I lived a very self-centered life, I had people always coming over to take advantage of me all the time. But I've never, it could happen, but not once since I've been trying to practice compassion, I've had anyone try to take advantage of me. In fact, I find people who want to help me, who want to understand, well, how do you do that, and so forth. So it's like, and so I think we have this misunderstanding about compassion. We think it's all soft and all, and this is why we get overwhelmed, because we're just trying to fulfill all these needs. And sometimes it's okay to put the brakes on and say, no, can't do that, won't do that, not good to do that, and so forth. And if it's done in the right way, in a compassionate, loving, kind way, it'll be received, and so forth. I don't want to get burnt out, on this path. Right. I found my fit, and so I just slow it down, and I enjoy the ride, I enjoy the experience, and so forth, and I try not to get myself in those situations where I feel overwhelmed.
Right. Yeah, and I appreciate what you said, Andre, because I think it really does speak to the fact that we all have to acknowledge that this is a process of moving in that direction, and we have to be willing to accept the limits that we do feel at any particular time, and particularly when we're not going to help the other person really by saying yes, by going along with everyone else, just because frequently that's driven more by us wanting to please others than it is by our really genuine concern for them. So, yeah, it becomes distorted at that level. Nonetheless, I mean, we can still say that these incredible beings, there's the wonderful story of the Buddha when he was a bodhisattva. Again, how literal these stories are, I can't say, but it exemplifies the degree to which one could embody compassion towards other beings. There's the story that many of you have heard. It's in the Golden Light Sutra, where the Buddha is this prince who's out with his brothers, and he comes across a tigress who's starving. There's been a drought, and so there's no nourishment for the tigress, and she's just had 5 cubs. These cubs are going to die. The tigress is going to die. And the bodhisattva prince, who later became the Buddha, says, I've been practicing so many eons to be able to give my body to another being out of compassion for the suffering that tigress was experiencing and the death of the cubs that would ensue. I'm going to give my body now. And, cuts open his own neck and starts feeding the tigress, and the tigress eats him, and they all live. And they become like the Buddha's disciples. The 5 cubs become like the 5 initial disciples of the Buddha at Deer Park. That sounds pretty outrageous. And do any of us have the compassion to do that at this moment? And is that being taken advantage of or being used? I mean, it would depend upon your perspective. The perspective of the Bodhisattva prince was, this is what I've been praying for. This is the perfect opportunity for me to do that level of benefit to others. But are we there yet? No. I mean, so I agree with what you say, and yet acknowledge that there are levels that you can go to, and Rinpoche even talks about this frequently, that bodhisattvas want to be used by others. Why? Because that's kind of what gets them off. That's what bodhisattvas are about. That's what we were trying to do, is to be of use to others, to be of benefit to others. And that's a pretty outrageous example, and I'm not expecting any of us in the room to go out and practice it. In New Mexico, there's, occasional mountain lions and things. I wouldn't go like hiking in the woods and see a mountain lion with cubs and go, oh, great. I'm not there yet. It's just not going to happen right now. But I still have to acknowledge that I have the potential to get there, to be so selfless and so totally okay with benefiting other beings to that degree, not having any of that attachment to even this body, that I would willingly give it. I can see that as a possibility. Not there yet, though.
Yeah, Shantideva said, right, that Shantideva said, I've already given my body, so what does it matter what you do with it?
Right, exactly.
And so forth. So I think that's the whole idea, is like, I'm willingly being compassionate. Mm-hmm. So if you take advantage of me, that's on you. That's not on me, because I'm willingly doing this for you, knowing that you could do that. Yeah.
And there's always kind of these both sides to it, because there's the other story of when he was a bodhisattva ship captain, and he actually took the life of somebody who was going to kill the other 499 people, the merchants on the ship. So, out of his compassion for both who was going to be killed and the person who was going to do that killing, he decided to actually take a life in that situation. So once more, it requires some wisdom to know what is the right thing to do at any particular time. And if we're only going to create more misery and problems and difficulties for others through our acts, well, then that's not so beneficial. If we're going to actually help them in ways that are genuine, that will allow us to progress spiritually, be better capable to benefit them and help them in the moment, then how wonderful. So it's a complicated path. We can't just take it at face value, black and white. Everything is exactly the way it's supposed to be. We always have to apply where we are at that particular time. And the initial part of the path is saying, okay, I just need to take care of myself. That's what the first 2 levels of the stages of the path, the Lam Rim, are built on, is I need to attend to my own suffering. And many of us want to jump right to, I want to have compassion for all beings. But if you don't really spend the time looking at your own suffering and examining it, your compassion is going to be faulty. So start there. Be somewhat selfish in your own point of view of looking at what needs to be addressed for yourself. And then apply that same understanding for every other being. So once more, that's why we go through this gradual progression, is because we're not ready to enter right at university level. We need to, do all the work that precedes that. So, any other comments? Thanks for these. Yes, Christine.
I want to continue what you're saying, because this is extremely helpful for me. I've been really, really struggling with an issue for years, and I recently tried to ask about it, and actually even asked the question, and everyone answered. I guess I didn't word it right, because everyone answered it in terms of this. It's not exactly compassion in my case, but I won't bore everyone with it. How do you know when? It's your compassion. At what point is it no longer good for the person that you're giving it to? But I was wondering about myself. I mean, because I have a hard time knowing. I guess I'm not very self-aware, and I don't know at what point where it's becoming hurtful to me. That the compassion that I'm giving out, and because I don't realize it until I'm burnt out. So, and actually, the situation that I have an issue with. I feel awful because I'm in debt and can't give to the center and to teachers and stuff. And every time that I'm at a retreat and you making up your envelopes, I struggle. Can I afford $25 or $35? And because it was different when we didn't have credit cards, and we had this much money and that was it. But now when you're in debt and you're just like, I get so upset. I feel guilty when every time they bring up about giving money, I just feel awful. And I don't know at what, I give some, but I don't know at what point I'm actually damaging myself. I can't find that line. So I see now, and no one ever understood this question. They always took it to mean like, worrying about whether the hobo you're giving money to is going to spend it on booze or something. But it was more about, I can't figure it out. And so this is kind of like the compassion, knowing where to stop, but in terms of your own health. And this is the closest that any teaching has come to addressing this issue with me, although it's about compassion instead. But I don't know. But it was helpful, somewhat, but I still don't know my limits. But thank you.
Well, and I think that this is something, again, you'll hear different teachings at different levels of the path. Once more, the willingness to give everything away is only being practiced by those who have that ability. It should only be practiced by those who have that ability. In fact, this story I just related about the Buddha giving his body when he was the Bodhisattva prince, well, they caution you. That is not a teaching that we should take to heart and go out and feel like we can immediately do that. I'm going to give all my organs to all the people who need them and, kill ourselves because we want to be generous to others. That's not an appropriate way to interpret this, because most of us are not at that level. I'd say maybe give a kidney, give some bone marrow, give whatever, give some blood. A lot of people gave blood yesterday. We can rejoice, So there's lots of things that we can do that can fit into our capability. And we should just keep nudging that up till we become more and more capable. And generosity is an example too, where we can be moved by the suffering of others. This is one of the compassion leads to a lot of these practices, to generosity. Because if we have compassionate concern, then we will care about those who are in need, to what degree that we can give. But we have to balance that with what do we need for our own survival to some degree. And many teachers will say that.
It's hard to know. 2 weeks ago I gave $7 to a person on the street, but
right.
now I have $40 in my bank account and you
right.
go grocery shopping.
And just as a side point on this, because we need to get back to compassion, but generosity is definitely one of the things that springs from compassion. First of all, we need to be really clear about always our motivation in giving, that makes sure that we're as genuinely in touch with bodhicitta, with our desire to benefit others, and not have any sort of mind that will taint it in terms of, because some people give out of pride, some people give out of pity, some people give out of, whatever, different delusions. But the other thing is then to also have this trust that all of our acts of generosity have their effects in time. I had one teacher who told me if we had absolute conviction in the karma of giving, we would give it all away right now because we'd have complete faith and trust that would all come back to us. I'm not there yet, sorry, I don't go emptying my bank accounts and give them to everybody and just hope that, my bank accounts are going to fill again. I just don't have that level of conviction yet. I honestly say that. And I think we all are working towards having that ability. There was a nun who worked in the office up in Taos My current partner was working in the office at the time, and he would occasionally give money to her. And he see her, he'd go, "Oh, you don't have any money, let me give you something." He'd give her $20. And then he'd see her turn around and giving it to Liberation Prison Project or some other thing, And he'd be really upset, why did she give this away? And I was like, oh, she's just really practicing the cycle of generosity, that, when you receive, then you're happily giving. Pretty advanced practitioner in my mind. But we can see it and almost call it foolish, because somebody is taking that and just channeling it elsewhere. So everyone's going to practice at their own level is the point I'm making. I'm not saying you should be like the nun, or you should be like the Bodhisattva prince, or you should be like any of these. You should be like Christine.
I need to find out what Christine's level is. I think I need to see an account.
And the one thing to understand is that it doesn't mean that we have to give physical resources either. Our compassion frequently can call upon us to give in other ways. Even just to give loving kindness to others is one of the ways of giving. In the moment, just to send that out and say, you may see a homeless person that you don't have the resources to benefit at the moment. Sorry, no money in my pocket. But you can wish them well in your thoughts, Or you can just say, I can't give you any money, but I have a few minutes if you'd like to sit down and talk. I mean, my gosh, homeless people, they need somebody to identify them as just a valid person on the street sometimes, rather than, turning away and wanting nothing to do with them. Just do whatever.
Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many ways that you can give. So don't think that you have to have resources. This is what Master Shantideva says in one of his texts. It's those without resources, you find other ways to give. So anyway, compassion is the root of all of this.
I
Yes,
want to
Anna.
quote Venerable Robina. She would say, darling, she says, she called everybody darling. Dear, you can't help others. You can't even help yourselves at this time. So.
Yeah, exactly. No, we have to be okay acknowledging that. So let's see. Did we even read through what's in page 3? Did I read that? I think I did. Did I read that? No, that's okay. I'm just trying to wrap things up. We only have a few more minutes. I read the quote. Okay, so what we'll do tomorrow is a little different because we will have folks coming in for the Sunday teaching, but I think they'll all appreciate a nice little meditation on compassion. What I would like you to do as homework, if possible, is just to kind of read through what's there for immeasurable compassion for the meditation. And we'll do a portion of that at least tomorrow morning. You'll notice that there's another addendum that's referred to there, and that's on page 4 is the reference to the addendum. Addendum 2, Points for Meditation on the Suffering of Sentient Beings. It's on pages 9 and 10. And this is just a little glossary of kind of the various sufferings that the Buddha set out. It's more of a list than a glossary. The first 3, there's for the 3 types of suffering. I'll talk about these a bit more tomorrow, but I think most of us in the room have heard that teaching, that this is like the way that the Buddha initially kind of set out what our situation is that we're all in what's called this state of dukkha. Dukkha is a Sanskrit word that essentially means dissatisfaction, or we translate it as suffering. But it's not just the gross form of suffering, and that's what's on the bottom of page 9 is what we call suffering, or suffering of pain. And those are those experiences that we clearly identify as such. Then we go to the top of page 10, we see that the Buddha went on to say that there's also what we call the dukkha of change, which is the fact that even those pleasant experiences that we have aren't capable of satisfying. Remember, I was explaining earlier today how temporal happiness, the happiness that we can wish for others that is in the moment, isn't going to ultimately satisfy. In fact, it is a form of dukkha. Now, does that mean that we're wishing for others to suffer when we want them to have temporal happiness? Well, not really. I mean, we want them to have a level of comfort so that they can use their life meaningfully, so that they can actually do something purposefully with that. We don't want them to have, millions and millions of dollars and what have you, and then just get more greed and desire and avarice and what have you. So it's important that we recognize that all of those transitory experiences of pleasantness are just that. They don't last, and they don't provide any long-term satisfaction or freedom from our problems. I sometimes point out how, I could bring in, Venerable Rabina always likes chocolate cake, right? So, and many of you like chocolate cake. Maybe some of you don't like chocolate cake, and if so, then you can substitute whatever cake you like, or pie, or whatever. But if I were to bring in a chocolate cake and say, oh, Linda, would you like a piece of chocolate cake? And Linda could say, no, thank you. I'm still experiencing the pleasure from the first piece of chocolate cake I had. Well, then it would be different, right? Then we would have an experience of pleasure that lasted and that fully satisfied and that doesn't require another piece of cake in order for it to happen. But we know that's not the case. We just keep going back to these pleasures again and again and again because we have the illusion that they're helping us to be happy. Happy in the moment, but they don't lead to any real lasting satisfaction. And in fact, if we were to, continue to eat chocolate cake, for example, it doesn't make you happier. Piece after piece after piece, you're not all blissed out. You're actually, about ready to throw up. So we know that these aren't real experiences of happiness. Therefore, they are the suffering of change. Pervasive conditioned suffering is the fact that we are in this state of samsara that is conditioned by our karma and delusions. We frequently use the idea that it's worded there, we're under the control of our karma and delusions. This is the 24/7 suffering. This is the fact that no matter what we do, no matter where we go, it pervades all of our experiences and all of samsara, whatever existence you have, you're in a state of suffering. It's like you're in prison all the time. We have to really get that and understand that level of suffering for ourselves and for others, to have that full compassion. Otherwise, we only have compassion when people have the suffering of suffering, when beings are experiencing that type of pain or anguish. And we don't have compassion otherwise. So we have to work with these. Again, I just listed the other ones, the 6 types, the 8 types, the specific sufferings of the various realms, which Rinpoche emphasizes frequently. And I gave you some footnotes for Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand, where you can go and find more teachings on those various types of suffering. I won't have time to go into all of those, but it's important that we recognize the varieties of suffering that beings are going through and the extent to which it encompasses their whole experience in samsara. Then our compassion will be quite complete and genuine, because we're not just, again, contingent upon grosser forms of suffering to generate that mind. So if you could just read through those, again, just get familiar with it. Any questions or comments about compassion? I'll talk a bit more about compassion tomorrow. I don't think I'm quite done with it, but anyone? Wow, you guys have been so attentive today. This has been great. I've enjoyed this a lot. So, yes, Anna.
Is compassion the same as bodhicitta?
So Anna's question is, compassion the same as bodhicitta? They sometimes sound like they're equated, but we can actually say that compassion is what precedes bodhicitta, and bodhicitta is a bigger idea than just compassion. It is motivated by compassion as well as love, loving kindness, but it's the bigger thought of wanting to relieve the suffering of others and place them in happiness by becoming a Buddha oneself. Right, it includes that additional aspiration. Wanting to achieve the welfare of others, which again is placing them in happiness, freeing them from suffering by becoming a Buddha oneself. So we need to have that accompanying thought. Otherwise, we could have this kind of just general thought that we'd like to do that, but if we don't subscribe and sign ourselves up for the whole bodhisattva path and our attainment of Buddhahood, we're kind of missing the means of being able to accomplish that. I'll talk about this tomorrow afternoon. Absolutely. The analogy I frequently use for that, and I may repeat this tomorrow depending on who's all here, is if you were really, say there's a young girl who has many people in her family who develop cancer, and so she becomes very moved as a young girl to become an oncologist, to actually help people with cancer. Well, let's say she starts off with saying, oh, I would really like to be able to help all these people with cancer. Look at how these family members of mine have suffered. Well, if it just stops there and she has this wish to benefit others, but she never does anything to become qualified to help people with cancer, there's not a lot of point to it. It's wonderful, great that she has that thought, but will it actually do anything to alleviate the suffering of those with cancer? No. Whereas if she accompanies that thought of, I want to benefit people with cancer by becoming an oncologist, by training myself through medicine to be able to benefit others in that way, then it's so much more powerful, right? Then she's actually becoming qualified to be able to do the work of alleviating the suffering of cancer.
And so that's bodhicitta.
Bodhicitta is when we talk about the suffering of all beings, and you want to become a Buddha so you can alleviate their suffering and place them in bliss and happiness. So it's going beyond even cancer, but the cancer analogy is one way of looking at it, where we can have a very compassionate motivation, a very strong motivation, but if we don't accompany it with the means to be able to affect that, then it's kind of not complete.
Right there, I was reading.
Yeah.
Bodhicitta is the pure, holy mind and heart.
Yeah. So bodhicitta, we could describe it that way: the pure, holy mind and heart. It's the mind of awakening. It has those two aspirations: to benefit others, and Rinpoche emphasizes that's the main one, that we really want to be able to benefit others, and the secondary aspiration of therefore I need to become a Buddha. That's what Lama Yeshe was saying in that quote I said earlier, that essentially we need to be more capable of benefiting others. We need to be able to accomplish that.
Because if you do that, you help yourself.
And this is the thing, as you're saying, Anna, this is the fulfillment of your own potential too,
Oh, it's like a mirror, isn't it? The bodhicitta or so. It just reflects right back on us. It's amazing.
I agree. I mean, this is where, once more, it goes back to what I said earlier, that His Holiness says it's being wisely selfish. How we actually take care of ourselves best is by being dedicated to helping others.
Or at least don't harm others, right?
I think that's a good place to start, to just say, okay, I'm going to stop harming them. And then I'm going to eventually get to a place where I want to help them to the greatest degree. Not just to relieve cancer, not just to help those who need resources, not just to help those who are starving, but rather to bring all sentient beings out of their state of suffering, out of samsara, into Buddhahood.
So then when you achieve that holy mind and heart, you are a bodhisattva. I mean, you are a Buddha.
Well, we would say you are a bodhisattva.
A bodhisattva.
Yeah.
Oh.
Because then you are on the path that is going to develop your mind fully. It's kind of like when this young girl decides she wants to become an oncologist, then she dedicates herself very strongly to those courses and that plan that will get her through medical college and all the way to becoming a qualified oncologist and then benefiting others. So bodhicitta is like the mind that says, okay, I'm going to benefit others to this degree. Therefore, I'm going to dedicate myself to the path. Therefore, one becomes a bodhisattva by virtue of that. And I'll talk about this tomorrow in terms of the strength of mind of bodhicitta that we need to be technically a bodhisattva, to get your little bodhisattva card, with a little picture of you.
Because the lamas say that without bodhicitta, baby, forget about enlightenment.
Well, exactly. It precedes enlightenment. And we would say compassion precedes bodhicitta, because the original question of compassion versus bodhicitta, we have to have this deeper compassion before we can generate bodhicitta.
Because the bodhicitta comes from bodhisattvas, and the bodhisattvas come from sentient beings, and so it just goes on and on. It's interesting. Thank you.
Good. Yes, Andre, if you could just pass it up there,
This one is, because I'm
those
not
of you
quite
who,
sure.
by the way, those of you who need to leave, it's 4:00 already, 4:07 or 8 or something like that. I'm just going to answer one more question, and then we'll wrap up for today.
And
but
you
if you need to leave, that's fine.
And you don't have to answer this one if this is too much. But the immeasurable, we talked about what immeasurables mean.
Right.
I don't know if that's similar to paramitas. Or is obviously I'm not quite sure about the definition of paramita, or I wouldn't ask this question.
A paramita is usually defined as a perfection, and by that we mean kind of the perfected state.
Going
and immeasurable, and immeasurable is maybe again something that is also perfected in that state of Buddhahood, but is a little bit different, I think. Yeah. Okay, so let's wrap up things. Let's go to page 235 of the prayer book. And on page 235, we're just going to recite these first two prayers, dedicating all the positive potential we've created through everything that we've done here today, all the thoughts we've had, all the words that we've heard or shared ourselves, all of this for the complete enlightenment of ourselves and others. And in the second verse, we've been talking already about bodhicitta and meditating on this as our motivation. But we want to make that strong aspiration that that mind continue to deepen and grow in our own hearts and in the hearts of others. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. Then turn the page on 237 at the bottom. Rather than doing the individual prayers for our teachers, let's bring to mind His Holiness, Khenso Rinpoche, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, Geshe Gelek, all the other teachers that we and others have as guides. And through this prayer, when we make prayers for their good health and their long lives, and also for all beings to benefit from them. May the, it's the one at the bottom of page 237. May the glorious Guru's lives be long and stable. May all beings equaling the extent of space have happiness. May I and others without exception accumulate merit and purify negativities, and may we be blessed to quickly attain Buddhahood. Okay, thank you all very much. I'll see you tomorrow is at 10:30, I think, right? We start at 10:30, go till noon, and then there's a break for lunch. Okay, good.